Aloha and welcome to the Secret Art of Huna. Recently, I was talking to a client of mine who was telling me about a particular friend of hers who from time to time becomes very needy or starts doing a victim sort of a behavior. And my client found that when her friend went into these behaviors, it triggered her into a certain response. She would become a bit righteous and a bit brusque. And she didn't know where that came from, and it made the relationship with her friend quite difficult at times. So we were talking about what triggered it. We were talking about triggers, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So, why are triggers so important? Well, triggers are important because most of our behavior, like it or not, is actually a set of unconscious programs. So they're programs of behavior, sequence of behavior that sits in the unconscious until it's triggered. In computing terms, it's hitting the run button on a program. And the triggers can be many. The triggers may be something you hear, something you see, it may be the tone of voice, it may be a particular behavior, it may be a smell. Smells are amazing triggers. But so the triggers are things in our sensory experience, things that we sense that click us into this particular pattern or program. So for example, when I get up in the morning and I go into the bathroom and I wash my hands, I see my toothbrush and it triggers me to clean my teeth. And it's only first thing in the morning and last thing at night that the trigger works. I can go to the bathroom, wash my hands any other time, see my toothbrush, and I don't bother to clean my teeth. But there's something about the morning, getting up, going in there, wash hands, see toothbrush, clean teeth. And in the evening, knowing that it's the last visit to the bathroom of the day, see toothbrush, clean teeth. That's a classic program triggered by the action of going into the bathroom, washing the hands and seeing the toothbrush. Similarly, for years, I had a door that locked automatically when you closed it. Now, the downside of that was you did have to make sure that you'd got your key with you, otherwise you could get locked out. But the upside was I didn't have to think about locking the door once the door was closed. A couple of years ago, I replaced the door, and the new door, you actually physically have to lock it in order for it to be locked. The same thing, still have to remember to take the key, but the difference is once I'm outside, I've got to turn the handle and put the key in and lock it. Now, that program isn't as well established as the old program of walk out, pull door, it's done. So sometimes I have to double check that I've locked the door. I may be halfway down the street and I may have to go back and double check that I've locked the door, because sometimes the program doesn't quite run as efficiently as it might, because for so long I had that other program of door locks when I've closed it. Now, it's not just practical things like door locking or brushing your teeth that are programs. For years, I found it really difficult to get along with women who were red-headed called Anne. I'd known someone at school who was red-headed and called Anne, and for reasons that I can't for the life of me remember now, I hadn't liked her. So for years after leaving school, if I saw somebody with a woman with red hair called Anne, I didn't know quite how to relate to them. I'd feel queasy, uncomfortable, couldn't get on with them. Once I realised that this was a trigger from my childhood and I acknowledged it, I could laugh about it. And I now do have redhead friends called Anne who I get on with extremely well. But it took the recognition of the trigger and the recognition of how that fired off a pattern of behaviour before I could get on with redhead women called Anne. I know it sounds silly, but it's true. And there are probably lots of behaviours that you have where there's an unconscious trigger from your past and you run this behavioural pattern that doesn't make sense until you sit down and think about where it came from. So, How do you recognize those triggers? Because they're so important. They govern so much of our behavior, particularly our unwanted behavior, but also our wanted behavior. Brushing my teeth is a wanted behavior. I like that trigger. But there are many things, a person or a place or a smell, something I hear, a tone of voice, something I see, anything sensory can trigger off a pattern of behavior. And because it's unconscious, it's kind of outside my conscious control. So, how do you recognize them? Well, one of the best ways of recognizing them is when you notice yourself doing a pattern of behavior that's not very useful, ask yourself, is there something that's fired this? What was the start? What was the very first thing? How did I know to run this particular pattern of behavior? And if you sit and reflect and think about it, you may well find that it's a trigger from childhood. Very often our triggers are, or it's something that you've learned along the way. So the question is, what was the very first thing I did that fired off this pattern of behavior? How did I know to go into this pattern of behavior? Another way of finding out what your triggers are is to look at the behaviors of other people. I've been reading an amazing book by a woman called Debbie Ford. Debbie Ford was on the faculty of Deepak Chopra's group, and she was an expert in the shadow. And she wrote a great book called The Dark Side, Chasing the Light. I keep forgetting the title of it, but it's a great book, and I'll put it in the feed. Anyway, so I've just been reading this book, and it reminded me once again, as if I needed reminding, that we can use other people's behavior as a barometer for that which is hidden. And the shadow basically is about those aspects of ourselves that are hidden, that we don't acknowledge in ourselves. So when we see somebody else doing a behavior and we have a judgment on that, and that judgment has a charge. So for example, you may find that when you see people being angry, you don't like being around angry people, and you judge people for being angry. Classic one is judging people on their size. Racism is another form of shadow behavior. So we see something in someone else and we judge it because we don't like it. Now, I don't condone murder. So if I met a murderer, I wouldn't condone their behavior. But the question is, do I not condone, or do I judge and get emotional about it? And when you judge and get emotional about it, it's an indication that there's something somewhere in your unconscious that needs some healing, that needs some acknowledgement, that needs some resolution and some acceptance. So using other people's behavior as a barometer for what might be going on in your shadow, what your unconscious programs, what your unconscious triggers might be. So for my client with the needy victim friend, it was back to her childhood, and it was about a particular behavior that her mother did. And when people went into needy or victim, or what she perceived as needy or victim, it brought up for her a whole load of charge around her experience with her mum. So when we see the behavior, when we recognize that the behavior in other people, it does have a charge, it does make us feel in a certain way, then we can start to think about, okay, where have I seen that in my past? Where have I experienced that? And how might that be playing out a whole program for me that isn't particularly useful? So triggers are really, really useful things. They're useful because they can kick off useful behavior, but they're also useful things because when you indulge in a behavior that isn't particularly useful, so for example, you react to a particular kind of person in a particular kind of way, if you can identify the trigger and disconnect it, then you don't run the unwanted behaviour pattern anymore. Hope that's been useful and interesting for you. Look forward to hearing your comments. Post them on the YouTube channel or in the Facebook group, Secret Art of Huna. And I look forward to talking to you very soon.